Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Kansas Garden Hour Spring Kickoff Series. This is our first Garden Hour of the year, and we're so glad that you all could join us. It looks like not only from across the state of Kansas, but also from across the United States. So thank you all so much for joining us. If this is your first time with us, welcome. If you've been with us before, we're so happy to have you back. This webinar series began in 2020. We were hoping to share some extension information during the pandemic, and it's been wildly successful with over 16,000 participants since we began the series. This webinar series is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Ariel Whiteley-Knoll, and I am the horticulture agent for K-State Research and Extension in Shawnee County. Everyone that is involved in the development and the delivery of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture or some kind of related discipline, but we all have a love for educating and gardening. Before we get started today, we do have a couple housekeeping notes. Please make sure to use the Q&A feature for questions. So you're going to see the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. It's two little chat bubbles, and that's a great way for our moderator to be able to hold on to your questions and ask them to our speaker at the end. There's also a chat feature, which a lot of you are putting where you're from in the chat. That's a wonderful way to talk to your other program participants, and that's also where we're going to be sharing some helpful links. But if you do have specific questions for the speaker, it's much easier for us to filter those through if you use that Q&A feature. Our moderator today is Pam Paulson, the Reno County Horticulture Agent. She's going to be sharing some information and moderating that Q&A. And at the end, when we have questions with Rebecca, Pam will be the one asking those. Today's webinar is going to be recorded, and we're going to post it to the K-State Garden Hour website, which is where you registered for this series. We're also going to upload additional resources related to the topic. And if there are any links that are shared in the chat, we'll make sure that those get posted to the website. Our website is where you can also have access to previous topics and the upcoming topics for 2022. And that link will be shared in the chat in just a moment. Today's topic is vegetable varieties for bountiful harvests. And I am pleased to introduce Sedgwick County Horticulture Agent, Rebecca McMahon.
Thanks, Ariel. So I think if everyone has had a chance to complete the welcome poll, we will go ahead and end that poll. I think there's still a few more folks working on that. But anyway, to move on, we'll go ahead and end that poll. And so thanks for participating in that poll. I will show some of the results just really briefly. First question about, have you grown heirloom vegetables before? A number of you have grown heirlooms before, so we'll talk about that a little bit. And some of you have not. And then favorite vegetables, of course, no shock there, but tomatoes are far and away the most popular. And then peppers, leafy greens, and squashes kind of coming in. So that's a pretty typical mix of favorite vegetables. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get my slides up here. Okay, everything look good, Ariel?
Looks great.
Okay, awesome. So our topic today is selecting vegetable varieties for a bountiful harvest. And in general, our overall plan for the day is to start out by talking about just having a plan and starting knowing what you want out of your garden. We'll cover some general variety considerations, and some terms and things that you might see on plant labels or in seed catalogs. And help you decode a little bit of those things. We'll spend some time talking about the differences between hybrids and heirlooms and why you might choose one or the other. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but it is definitely a hot topic when we start talking about vegetable varieties. And then towards the end, we'll get into some more specific ideas and thoughts on considerations for certain vegetables, kind of hitting on some of those most common, most popular vegetables. Now, I'm going to start out right away by saying I don't have a best blank recommendation. Usually the question is tomato recommendation. So you don't even have to put it in the Q&A. I don't have what is the best tomato for Kansas or for, anywhere. because it is so dependent on your specific location and your specific preferences for what you want from your varieties. So sorry in advance, but I'm not going to tell you the secret best variety. And it's also not a secret. We're not hiding it from you. It truly is down to a lot of both personal preference and specific location science. So hopefully by the time we're done, you'll have some more tools in your toolbox that will help you figure out what the best blank variety is for you and your garden. So to start with, I want you to think about where you want to end up with your garden. At the end of the growing season, where do you want to be? And what do you want to have harvested from your vegetable garden? So some of you are probably looking at this picture of this flat chock full of cherry tomatoes, and you're looking at that going, that looks amazing. If I could have that from my garden, that would be the best thing ever. And others of you are probably looking at that picture going, that is my worst nightmare. I do not want that number of cherry tomatoes to ever come out of my garden because I have to pick them and just no. Full disclosure, I think our master gardeners that work in our demonstration garden, that picture is their worst nightmare. We've definitely had that experience a number of times in our demonstration garden. And cherry tomatoes can sometimes be a lot more work than folks are expecting from the harvest standpoint. So think about where you want to end up. Are you hoping to just have fresh produce for meals? Are you hoping to can? Are you hoping to freeze? Are you wanting learning experiences for your kids or grandkids? Are you wanting to donate produce? What is your end goal? Because that is also going to inform your decisions for your varieties in particular. So before you get to that step of choosing varieties, what is that gardening goal and why do you grow each particular vegetable? And what do you hope to do with it? I know for me in particular, it fluctuates from year to year. Some years I go into the season knowing I really want to have enough tomatoes to make fresh salsa every week and have BLTs regularly, and I want to have enough tomatoes to can or put into the freezer. Other years, I'm like, oh, well, I've still got, 10 pounds of tomatoes in the freezer from last year. So if I don't have lots of extra tomatoes this year, that's not a big deal. So maybe I'm going to choose varieties that I know might not be as productive. And all of those sorts of things. So why are you growing a particular vegetable? How do you plan to use it? And how much do you really want to be using that item? At this point, and this is a whole nother presentation on garden planning, but do want to remind you that it is important to know your own garden space. Because if you don't know how much space you have, you're going to make poor choices about both the varieties you choose, but also the number of different varieties that you choose. So I know that in my home garden, in a normal year, I can choose to have 5 to 7 tomato plants. And, between those 5 to 7 plants, I then have to decide how many of each variety I want to have. So I usually choose 1 or 2 cherry tomatoes and 2 or 3 Romas and 2 or 3 slicers, depending on exactly what my goal is that year. And then I know that I can have between 2 and 4 cucumber plants. And depending, again, am I planning to make pickles this year? Am I not making pickles this year? So I know my space, I know how much space I have to allot to different things. And every year I kind of rethink through what's my process, what am I hoping to get out of my garden. You're also going to want to know your garden season. For those of us in Kansas, we have 3 different planting seasons. We have a spring, kind of an early spring, our late spring to summer season, and then our late summer to fall season. So are you planting, for instance, if you really like beets and you want to have enough beets to either put them in the freezer or make pickled beets, you can plant beets in the spring, or you can plant beets in the fall, or you can plant both. And so that makes a difference on your variety choice, and how much of your garden you're going to plant, and all of those different things. So you want to know, especially with your cool season vegetables, are you planting in the spring or the fall or both? Because that may impact your variety choice. And then there's also this question of, are you planting direct from seed or are you buying plants? If you're going to be buying plants for things like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant, you may be limited by what choices you have in your local garden centers and nurseries. That doesn't mean what we're talking about today is not relevant to you. You just may not have the wide variety of choices if you're starting your own plants from seed. So for a whole bunch more resources on garden planning, 2 resources that we have for you are the Kansas Garden Guide, which you can download a free copy. I think we'll throw that into the chat for you, as well as the Vegetable Garden Planting Guide. So the Planting Guide is a much shorter publication, has a great calendar and talks about spacings and all that good stuff. The Garden Guide has tons and tons of information. So if these couple slides I've talked about with garden planning are new to you, new information, check out those resources to kind of get you further along that path. So the last thing that we want to think about before we start choosing our specific varieties is to think about your specific garden challenges. So if you have gardened in the past, this is the time to think through, what diseases have I struggled with? And can I look for resistant varieties that might help out with that? Have I experienced root knot nematodes in my garden? Particularly for those of you in the southern half of the state or that have sandier soils, you may have had that experience. And so that's an important consideration with variety selection. Many of us in Kansas deal with heavier clay soils, so we want to be really honest about our soil conditions. And then also our ability to rotate our crops around. Some of us have very small gardens in a more urban lot. Some of us have large gardens in a more rural area. And so your ability to rotate and plant different things in your garden every year might vary from place to place. And so the less option you have for rotation, the more important it is to consider disease-resistant varieties and things like that. You also want to think about your specific weather challenges. Many of us here in Kansas are going to deal with heat at different times of the year. And it's not just heat in July and August. Sometimes that means heat in April or heat in October, times when we don't maybe think we should have heat, as well as, of course, drought and wind, all of those great weather challenges. So thinking through, what are your specific weather challenges, and maybe even specific weather challenges that you experience at different times in your gardening season. So let's talk about some characteristics to consider with our varieties. And so we're going to start really general, and we're going to get more specific as we go. So in general, when you are thinking about variety selection, these are some of the things you might consider. Now, for each of you, the relative importance of these different things may vary. If you have a strong preference for organic methods, you may have a strong desire to look for varieties with higher levels of disease resistance and insect tolerance. Even if you don't care about organic methods, you may still want to look for varieties with some insect tolerance or disease resistance. You may want to consider yield. Now, some of you are probably going, well, duh, why wouldn't everyone want to consider yield? And I will refer you back to that initial picture of the cherry tomatoes. Sometimes you don't necessarily need the highest yield on, on a particular plant. I am not a fan of eggplant, so I typically don't plant it in my garden. Period. But if I were, for some reason, to decide to plant eggplant, high yield would not be my priority. It might be I'm going to plant one eggplant plant that will have enough eggplant on it for 1 or 2 recipes over the course of the summer, and that meets my needs perfectly well. That is my max my max yield for eggplant for the season. Or for example, I'm the only person in my family that particularly cares to eat okra. And so I don't need max yield on my okra plants. I just need enough to keep me happy. And everyone else is happier if they don't see it that often. So different yield needs, being pretty honest with yourself about what those yield needs actually are. And then flavor aspects, for many of us, when we're growing vegetables in our own garden, we want to make sure that the flavor is better than what we can buy from the grocery store. So those flavor characteristics. That is another common question I get is, well, what's the best tasting tomato? Well, even in that, there's a lot of personal preference when it comes to flavor and what your expectations are. Color anymore, there are so many different colors of different vegetables out there. So that may be something that is important to you. This picture here, these are fall radishes with one random beet in there. And so I've got red and purple and green, all kinds of different colors. Texture, different varieties have different textures. Not to belabor tomatoes excessively, but one of the things that folks find when they start growing more heirloom tomatoes is that some heirlooms have a very much different and often softer texture than some of the more recent hybrid varieties. And some folks find that extremely distasteful. They feel like they're mealy or soft and they really dislike those textures, whereas other folks don't mind that softer texture. So texture is something to keep in mind as well. And then vegetable size and shape. Again, some folks get really offended if their eggplant variety that they choose has small little eggplant. Others want that small eggplant and don't want the big eggplant. So the size and shape you're looking for. And then last but definitely not least, particularly for those of you maybe looking at growing in containers or more compact garden areas, is to consider the plant size and shape. One of the really nice things that has come out of the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years of breeding and development in vegetable varieties is that there's a lot of varieties that are really well adapted to containers or to very small spaces. So you can choose dwarf tomato plants that'll grow in a fairly small container. The last couple of years, there's even been some very small, compact, they call them baby cauliflower varieties that are designed for containers. So they take up much less space and can be grown in a container. So all of those are things that you may want to look for when you are thinking through variety choices. Do we have any questions that are critical to answer right now, or can we keep going?
I think it looks good.
Okay, so, well, we will keep going then and let y'all keep handling the questions in the Q&A. So let's talk about some specific terms that you may see either on plant labels or in seed catalogs. One of the first ones I want to talk about a little bit is called days to maturity. So in some places you may see that abbreviated as DTM for days to maturity, or more often I see it just as days. So if you look in the catalog, on a seed packet, on a plant label, somewhere you are likely going to see somewhere that it says 52 days or 73 days. And this is one of those places where it's really important to know what they mean when they say that. In most cases, if it is something that is traditionally direct seeded, meaning you put the seed directly into your garden, something like green beans, for example, or carrots, that number, that days, is the number from when the seed is planted. So if you see on a green bean packet, it says 55 days, it's saying to expect, on average, your first harvest to be 55 days from when that seed is planted. Now, of course, this is an average. And lots of things can happen as far as temperature and weather and different parts of the country and things like that. But it's a good general guideline. For plants that are typically transplanted, so for example, things like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, most of the time that number, that days that you see, is the days from when you transplant the plants into your garden. So if you're starting your own plants from seed, you don't count the days from when you start the seed indoors. You start counting on that transplant day. So this can get a little tricky sometimes because anymore, I've noticed, at least here, that garden centers tend to sell things as transplants that I would never consider transplanting, like the green beans or squash or cucumbers or things like that. So you do have to be a little cautious about things like that. And again, this is a place where if you're a relatively new gardener or you're growing something that you've never grown before, use that Kansas Garden Guide or other resources to determine if a vegetable is typically direct seeded or transplanted to help you gauge that days to maturity number. So why do we care? Why do we care the number of days to maturity? Why do we care if the tomatoes take 52 days versus 120 days? Why do we care if the lettuce is 30 days versus 45 days? And there's a couple different reasons for this. One of them is simply, it just allows you to schedule your plantings properly, especially if you are doing a more complex planting schedule. Maybe you're doing some spring radishes followed by tomatoes, followed by a fall spinach planting. It allows you to make sure that you have enough time to plant and harvest before you move on to the next crop. So that's one reason. The other reason is that those days to maturity become really important when we start to understand the interplay, particularly with our Kansas weather. For those of you in Kansas, kind of familiar with the growing season, I know from looking at the states of folks that are participating, a number of you are also kind of transition zone. I saw a lot of Tennessee folks and Missouri, so you're kind of in the same zone as we are and have probably kind of a similar experience of, spring and fall with a hot summer. So if you're significantly north or south of us here in Kansas, you may want to find a more local extension resource to think about your growing season and things like that. But days to maturity becomes so important when we start thinking about what is going to tolerate our weather conditions. And I think this will make more sense as we kind of progress on a little bit here. So some specific examples on days to maturity, and not everything to be sure. But for example, tomatoes, you can find tomatoes that range anywhere from 52 up to well over 100 days to maturity. That is a huge range. That is like 50 days difference. That's well over almost 2 months difference between that expected first harvest. And for tomatoes, that becomes really critical because if you've ever grown a tomato in Kansas, you know that there is a point in the summer where it gets too hot and the tomatoes stop setting fruit. So what happens if your tomato is 90 days to maturity and it gets too hot for the plant to set fruit? About a month before you're hoping to have tomatoes. It means that you're probably not going to get any fruit set until later in the summer or even the fall when the weather cools down. So with our tomatoes in particular, a long day to maturity variety can sometimes not produce anything at all, depending on how our summer weather pans out. So other varieties, sweet corn, you've got a range of 62 to 94 days. Broccoli is a little shorter, 55 to 75. Eggplant, you've got a 30-day range. Lettuce even, you've got a 30-day range. And lettuce, for example, this is a difference between like a leaf lettuce and a head lettuce. And for us in Kansas, a lot of times we don't recommend those larger heading varieties of lettuce because that 75-day to maturity, by the time you plant in March, 75 days is, so if you plant mid-March, 75 days is the first part of June. And usually it is too hot by that point and the lettuce has started to get bitter, it started bolting, and you're not going to have a good quality product. So, that day to maturity is important with our cool season crops as well. So you can see quite a bit of range. Some varieties, some vegetables have a much shorter range. Peas usually have a much tighter range than some of these other varieties. The days to maturity also becomes really critical when you are looking at heirloom varieties. Some of the heirloom varieties can really stretch our outliers on these numbers. So I just wanted to show this a little bit. If you're looking at a seed catalog or something like that, here on the screen, this is just a screenshot of what that might look like. And usually when you're looking at that catalog, somewhere fairly close to the name of the variety, it's going to say the number of days to maturity. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit about with our terminology is disease resistance. And this gets a little bit more complex. There's not just one thing it means. And this is most critical when we're looking at tomatoes because we see the most numbers of different types of disease codes with the tomato varieties, although we do see them occasionally with peppers and things like that. So depending on what you're looking at, a lot of times with tomatoes in particular, after the name of the variety or underneath it, we can even go back here on this previous slide. It's really small to see it here, but you can kind of see, with some of these, it's got a V or an F or an N or things like that right next to the days to maturity. So very common when you're looking at tomatoes in particular to see all of these different letter codes. So the V is verticillium wilt, the Fs are fusarium. There's 3 different races of fusarium. So depending on the race, they may have 1 F or 2 Fs or 3 Fs, and sometimes they use subscript numbers as well. N is nematode resistance. TSWV is tomato spotted wilt virus. EB is early blight. We don't see that one very often. It's not a common resistance. S is septoria. So if you find a tomato that has an EB or an S in their code, snap them up because we have lots and lots of early blight and septoria challenges in Kansas, and there's very few varieties that are actually resistant to those things. So there's lots of other disease resistance codes out there, for all kinds of different viruses and diseases and so on and so forth. A good quality seed catalog, somewhere in the catalog, either down along the bottom or in one of the earlier pages in the catalog, should have kind of a key for you that's going to tell you what those things are. And I should say that in general, just because there's a long list of things after the variety name doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatically a good choice for you in your garden. not everything is a problem in Kansas. For example, there's been lots of new varieties come out in the last 5 years or so that are resistant to late blight. Well, that's amazing if you live in the Pacific Northwest or the Northeast or the northern part of the US or any place that tends to have cool and wet weather at any point in the summer season. But for those of us in Kansas, our weather conditions are pretty much never conducive to late blight. And so late blight resistance doesn't do us much good at all. So when you're looking for that disease resistance, that's a little bit of what you're looking at. And again, lots of different things to consider. Usually, most commonly things that we might be looking for are the verticillium and the fusarium resistance, as well as the nematode resistance. If you've ever had tomato spotted wilt virus, that's always beneficial. And then when we get into some of our vine crops, things like powdery mildew resistance, lesser but can be helpful, downy mildew resistance, but particularly the powdery mildew resistance can be critical with our vining plants. Okay, I promised we'd talk a little bit about hybrids and heirlooms. And I know from the poll at the beginning that a number of you felt pretty confident about the differences between hybrids and heirlooms, but some of you weren't as sure, and some of you are newer gardeners. So hopefully we won't belabor this too much, but it is important to understand what we're dealing with vegetable varieties. So hybrid vegetables are crosses between at least two different parents. And the seed that is then harvested and sold is from that first generation cross. And so because of that, the saved seeds are not going to come true to type. So that's one really important piece of information for a gardener, is that if you plant a hybrid, you cannot save the seed and expect to get something comparable from the next generation. It is also really important to understand that a hybrid is not automatically a genetically modified organism. There are very, very few GMOs in vegetable production, and they're very difficult to come by from a home garden standpoint. You're not going to run across them all that frequently. So a hybrid is a cross that would have occurred naturally, could have occurred naturally, but it is usually aided by humans making specific selections and doing that crossing. And so these hybrids have been bred and selected for what is, the best combination of characteristics. Now, I will say that sometimes we find that those hybrids have been selected for really great yield or disease resistance and may leave a little bit to be desired in flavor or skin texture or other quality considerations. So I'm not like an all hybrid all the time person, but we'll talk about heirlooms a little bit. So on the flip side, heirlooms are what is called open pollinated. And I've got some slides that are going to kind of explain what that means a little bit more. So they started still from that same initial cross, but they've been crossed and the seeds saved over at least 6 generations so that the genetics are stable. And that means that if you plant an heirloom and you are careful about the pollination requirements and setback distances and all kinds of other genetic things, you can save the seed and expect it to come more or less true to type. There are some really great books and resources out there about saving seed. If that is of interest to you, that is, again, a whole nother presentation. The other piece about heirlooms is that generally heirlooms are considered to be at least 40 to 50 years old. So they are not necessarily new varieties. They often have really interesting stories that come along with them, and they are varieties that have been around for a long time. You could say, that they've stood the test of time to a certain extent. So you may realize that there's actually some in-between varieties, and we'll talk about those in a few slides here. So when we look at our vegetables, we have open pollinated varieties and hybrids. Under our open pollinated, we talked about what heirlooms are, but it's important to know that there are open pollinated varieties that are not heirlooms. And this is a point where sometimes the seed catalogs and the marketers don't always help us out a whole lot. And it may or may not matter to you depending on what your gardening goals and preferences are. So you can have open pollinated varieties that are genetically stable where you can save seeds, but they're new crosses. The breeding has been done recently. They're less than 40 years old. There's lots and lots actually new open pollinated varieties that have been developed in the last 10 to 20 years. So, just because something is open pollinated doesn't make it an heirloom. Some of those open pollinated varieties are new enough, you might think they're hybrids, but they're actually not. So just a really quick dive into some of the genetics, partly because I love genetics and breeding, and I think it helps to kind of visualize what this looks like. So with a hybrid variety, they have these breeding lines, and in a very simple way of looking at it, they have parent A and parent B. They cross them, they cross-pollinate them, and they harvest the seed and sell you that seed. So when you see in a catalog after the name and it says F1 or F1 hybrid, that is what it means. It means that it is the seed that is the F1 or the first generation from that parent A crossed with parent B. And because of that, it is not genetically stable. So what's an open pollinated variety? How do we get there? So the fun fact is it actually starts exactly the same way. It starts with parent A crossed with parent B and getting this F1 hybrid. But then what happens is they self-cross that F1 hybrid with itself, so it's a self-pollination type situation, and see what they get. So in my completely fictitious vegetable here, I have crossed, two F1 hybrids that are blue with orange stripes, and I now have a random oblong blue with orange stripes, a round with orange stripes, a round blue, and a round orange with stripes. And so from there, as a breeder, I can say, oh, I really like the characteristics of this one. And I'm probably choosing from more than just the fruit characteristics. And so I'm going to save those seeds and I'm going to plant those out and I'm going to cross those again. And that next cross, now I've got two that are oblong and striped, one that's round and striped, and I still got that one off type that's that orange one. So I'm going to, again, save the seeds only from the ones with the characteristics that I want, and I'm going to keep crossing those. And every time I cross and save seeds, my seed line, my genetics become more pure. And so you can see the diversity is being reduced every generation. And so if I keep doing that and keep selecting the varieties and keep selecting the plants and saving the seeds from the plants with the characteristics that I want to have, then by the time we get to the 6th generation, you generally have about 98 to 99% genetic stability, meaning that there's going to be relatively minimal genetic variation in that variety. And we can expect that if we save seeds, they're going to come true from that seed planted every year. So there's a whole lot more that goes into vegetable genetics and seed saving and all of those sorts of things. But that is, when we say the variety is open pollinated, that is what we mean, is that I can plant these seeds from the 6th generation cross and get plants that I expect to be within this broad range of what the variety should be, and then I can save seeds and continue to expect the same result in general from that variety. So that is what an open pollinated variety is. And then an heirloom variety is simply one of those varieties that has been around for a long time. And it's interesting, some folks actually will take hybrid varieties and go through the process to create an open pollinated variety that has the characteristics of that particular hybrid variety. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So why would we consider hybrids over heirlooms? In general, some of the reasons that some folks prefer hybrids is hybrid varieties tend to have a higher level of consistency or uniformity in their production. So you can expect that all of the carrots are going to be ready to harvest at about the same time, and that all of the carrots are going to be the same size and shape. Or color even. So there's more consistency and uniformity. And that can be really important, especially if you are focused on feeding your family, on having, a great yield, things like that. Disease resistance can be more available with our hybrids, as well as those compact plant habits and traits. So all of those are reasons we might choose hybrids. On the other hand, there's reasons to consider heirlooms as well. You're definitely open to a lot more unique traits with our heirlooms and flavor characteristics. There's a lot more variation with our heirloom varieties. You may have different quality values than just simply yield or uniformity that are important. So this purple broccoli here, it's a purple sprouting broccoli, and it doesn't form a uniform head, but that's okay, because if you're planting that, you're probably not looking for a uniform head. It is important to know, again, with heirlooms, they may or may not have that consistency and uniformity. With some heirlooms, particularly vine crops, you can have really large plants that are larger than a hybrid plant might be, and that can be a challenge in a small garden. The quality and yield variations might be really wide, and so that's important to know in advance. On the plus side, some heirlooms are more adapted to specific growing conditions. Some heirlooms may have a narrow harvest window, like some heirloom melons really need to be harvested the day they're ripe. You can't wait on them. And you may have more susceptibility to certain diseases. It's also important to note that we also have any more what I consider heirloom type varieties out there. So these are varieties that if you just look at them at a glance, you might assume, oh, this is obviously an heirloom. But they are likely one of two things. They might be one of those newer open pollinated varieties that has some of the improved traits bred into them. Or it might be a hybrid variety where they have bred in some what I'll call quote unquote heirloom traits. A lot of times it's different colors, or these cherry tomatoes are kind of that striped coloration. This picture is from a number of years ago when this was just starting to be a thing, and they looked really pretty, but the skin was so tough. So in both cases, it's just important to be aware of what you're buying. And don't assume just because the color or shape of a vegetable is different from the norm that it is automatically an heirloom variety. So one last thing to talk about as far as a little bit of understanding what we're looking for in a seed catalog is weather tolerance. So when you're looking in a seed catalog or at a plant label and it says heat tolerant or cold tolerant or bolt resistant, what does that mean? So some things that you might want to look for, if you are planting cool season vegetables for a fall crop, if it talks about the ability to germinate in hot soil or warm soil, that is a really helpful trait because our soils in Kansas tend to be hot in July and August. On the flip side, maybe you want to be the first person to have cucumbers and you're always pushing to plant earlier and earlier. A cucumber variety that says that it will germinate well in cold soils could be something you want to look for. I'm always a little bit cautious, when I'm looking in a seed catalog and it says this variety is heat tolerant or this variety is cold tolerant. And part of that is just being aware of what those terms mean in the place that that variety is developed and tested. There's not a lot of variety development and testing kind of in this middle part of the US. And so, if I see a cool season vegetable that says it's heat tolerant, I may try it, but I'm not going to be shocked if it doesn't turn out to be as heat tolerant as I would expect it to be. Heat tolerance in a cool season vegetable is usually going to mean, it's going to be good quality for a couple more weeks into the early part of the summer, not that it's going to grow through the whole summer. So we may look for heavy soil resistance. That can be hard to find as well. And then last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about what bolting or bolt resistance means. So if you are not familiar with the term, bolting means it's usually applied to a cool season, a spring or fall planted leafy green, or sometimes a root vegetable. And bolting means that it is sending up its flower stalk to go to seed. So this picture here, this is actually a radicchio, and you can see it doesn't look like a normal radicchio. It's got a center stalk, and it's sending up that center stalk to move into its seed production phase, which means that it's going to be bitter. It's not going to be the quality that we want it to have. And so one of the things that can be helpful to look for with leafy greens and root vegetables is to look for varieties that are listed as slow to bolt or bolt resistant. And that means that even when the temperature fluctuates up and down, or we have warmer weather than you might expect in the spring or the fall, they're going to be less likely to bolt and go to seed than other varieties. So a lot of times when I'm choosing leafy greens, root vegetable varieties, I'm looking for those bolt resistant characteristics. Okay, so it is 12:47, so I didn't get to any of my specific vegetable guidelines. Are there any questions that we haven't been able to answer? Because otherwise I can keep going.
There are a lot of questions, Rebecca. The chat and the Q&A have been going wild, and Zach and Pam have done a great job, but I'm thinking it's going to be Pam, but either Zach or Pam have a lot of questions for you.
Okay. Or maybe not. Zach, Pam, any questions that you need me to answer?
I see that Pam is unmuted, but I am not hearing her.
No, I'm not either.
Okay.
Okay.
It looks like Pam's having some trouble with her microphone because she's muting and unmuting.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are, Pam. Perfect.
I think Zach and I tried to get most of them answered, but we did have questions on specific varieties for containers.
Okay. Oh gosh. Off the top of my head, I don't have any particularly specific recommendations. In general, I feel like most pepper plants do pretty well in containers. Most herbs do well in containers. From a tomato standpoint, which I'm guessing is where a lot of folks are going with that, you know, we've tried a number of different varieties, and some of that kind of depends what you're hoping to get out of and the size of the container that you're specifically looking for. Let me jump ahead to my tomatoes here, you know, because I think that may answer some of the questions. So, you know, I think most folks are probably familiar with the different types of tomatoes. Oops. So when you're looking at tomatoes, or for any garden space, but particularly in a container standpoint, you're probably looking for determinate varieties or compact varieties. You know, they're going to be shorter. And one of the things to know is that you may have a more concentrated harvest than if you're growing, like a lot of our varieties tend to be more indeterminate for home garden type situations. I will call out this particular variety that's pictured here. It's not what I would consider a dwarf plant, but it is a more compact Roma tomato. It's a variety called Early Resilience, and it's a variety that is supposed to be more resistant to blossom end rot than other Roma varieties. And we had it in our kind of relatively small tiered accessible bed, as well as two of our entry beds, which both of those are places that we kind of put it through the water stress test a little bit. And we also didn't cage them at all. We just kind of let them do their thing. So I wouldn't call that super well behaved and controlled, but the plants were extremely productive. The blossom end rot was not bad at all. And you know, compared to some varieties, relatively compact. So, you know, that's a more recent one that I've tried that has done pretty well. We had a number of other, we kind of did some different compact tomato plants last year. One called Geranium Kiss, and the yellow Tumbling Tom. And oh, I'm blanking on the other one. But they all kind of just have different characteristics. So a lot of that does depend on, you know, are you just wanting to have kind of a novelty plant that you can enjoy and get a few tomatoes off of, or are you really going like, I want a plant that can grow in a container, but I want to get a yield off of it. So that's one of those things to really keep in mind with that. So any other questions?
There have been a number about seed catalogs, recommendations for seed catalogs.
You know, so one of the things with seed catalogs is this, again, is a little bit of like what type of gardener you are and what you are looking for. I have a list as long as my arm of seed catalogs that I can look at. I personally like a lot of the companies that cater more towards small fruit and vegetable farmers, things like Johnny's, High Mowing, Territorial, those sorts of companies. But from a home gardening standpoint, like there's benefits to, you know, going back to Burpee and Park Seed and, you know, Gurney's and Young's, they all have good varieties to consider. Totally Tomatoes, Tomato Fest, if you're really into tomatoes and peppers and stuff like that. And then like if you like Asian varieties or Italian varieties, there's Seeds from Italy, there's Kitazawa. There's so many seed catalogs out there that yeah, and someone's probably asking why I haven't mentioned Baker Creek. So Baker Creek does a lot of heirlooms, things like that. So many different seed catalogs out there, and I'll have to say I've had good luck with seeds from all of them, and I've had duds from all of them. It's, you know, just depends on the variety that you end up with. Any other questions?
Then we had questions about resistance to squash bugs.
Okay.
Any varieties?
I will jump here. I do have a slide on that. So this is one of those kind of interesting things. When you get into squashes and pumpkins, this is a whole nother presentation too. When you get into squashes and pumpkins, the genetics actually become really important. There's 4 different species that are all cucurbitas: Cucurbita pepo, Cucurbita muscata, maxima, and mixta. Sometimes the mixta is now argyrosperma, I think, or gyrosperma. The botanists like to change things on us occasionally. And so most of our squashes and pumpkins are pepo and maxima species, and they are susceptible to everything. The squash vine borers love them, the squash bugs love them, everything loves them. But if you find varieties that are Cucurbita muscata, or the mixta or the gyrosperma, they actually have more resistance. Muscata, which is often like your butternut squashes, they are much more resistant to squash vine borers and often are less susceptible to squash bugs. They will still get squash bugs, but have pretty decent resistance to the vine borers. And the mixtas or gyrospermas are actually very resistant to both. Again, not to say they'll never get them, but they're quite resistant. And so from an actual variety standpoint, oh, do I not have a picture? There we go. 2 varieties that I've really enjoyed and that we've had really good luck with. The one here pictured on the left is, it's an Italian heirloom. It's called Tromboncino, and it has several other common names as well. And that one can be harvested kind of at that zucchini stage. And it's between 2 and 3 feet long with the ball on the end where the seeds are. So that whole neck is edible squash. It's a little bit different flavor than some of our more traditional zucchinis. So you have to adapt to that a little bit. And the plant is a large vine, so you have to trellis it. You can't just let it grow. So it's a different thing than a compact bush zucchini. But if you love zucchini, try that out because it will go crazy, and you will have zucchini coming out of your ears because they're 3 feet long. So the other variety that I have really enjoyed is this middle picture here, which is green striped cushaw. So cushaw squashes, which are native to the southern US and into Mexico. They're traditional southern varieties. They are hard winter squashes, and they make the best pumpkin pie you've ever had. We've grown them again on a trellis in our demo garden, huge plants. They go crazy. And then you've got these like 10 to 20 pound crazy huge squashes. But our master gardeners took them and made pie out of them, and the pie was amazing. So if you want that hard squash pumpkin kind of thing, I recommend looking for a cushaw variety because they're that mixta or gyrosperma species. And like, I think every time we've grown them, they're kind of like bugs, squash bugs, vine borers. What are those things? We don't know what those are, and haven't really had much problem with them to speak of. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do good scouting and other pest control practices, because under high pest pressure you will see some insects on those varieties, but they're kind of fun. So you can also look and see again that those muscata and mixta or gyrosperma varieties, this is where those heirlooms come in handy. You can kind of dig through and find there's a lot more like Japanese or Mexican heirlooms that genetically fit into those categories that might be a little more resistant. So now I'm seeing some, I'll type into the chat the variety names. So So it's the tromboncino and the green striped cushaw. Any other questions?
The only one that you really haven't touched on too much is your thoughts on what, last year seeds went pretty scarce pretty quick. Any thoughts on how that might be?
I really don't have any thoughts on that. It wouldn't surprise me to see some things be tight again this year. But I honestly haven't done a whole lot of looking. I think, a lot of folks ordered early last year being concerned about availability, but then I feel like things kind of evened out by the later part of the spring. So, yeah.
That's pretty much most of our questions, at least. This,
Okay.
like we've said, this will be recorded or is recorded, and it'll be on our website tomorrow. So we'll turn it over to Ariel and close us out.
Thank you, Pam. And thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a wonderful program. I know you couldn't even get to all the slides you wanted to because there's such a wonderful discussion. But like Pam said, this is going to be recorded. It should be on the K-State Garden Hour website tomorrow afternoon. And if you haven't already, take a look at that website because our spring and our summer schedule is excellent this year. So make sure that you're registered and that you have all of our dates on your calendar and that you're planning to attend. We so appreciate all of you for coming on today. You are going to receive an evaluation as soon as this program ends, and we would really appreciate it if you fill it out. That evaluation is how we tell our stakeholders that this program is worth supporting and worth keeping. So please take just a couple of minutes to fill that out. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you next time.